When I was about 12 years old, I went to the local department store. It's actually sort of weird to think about local department stores. I lived in a small town. It was hard to believe that this even existed in the 90s. It doesn't exist anymore. It was part of a mall that has been torn down because it has gone the way of many malls. But at that time, there was still a 5 and dime store. And you could go there and purchase 5-cent candy still and things like that. I feel like I'm really aging myself. I went to purchase a few things with my own money. I made my purchase and I walked out the door. And as I was looking at my change, I realized that the cashier had given me too much change. I had 7 cents more than I should have. I turned around, I went back, I explained the error, and I returned the 7 cents. And most people would think, why would you do that? But in that moment, that cashier was so thankful and said, "You're so honest." And I don't know if 7 cents makes me a superhero. But I knew in that moment that I knew the difference between right and wrong. Feeling confident about knowing the difference between right and wrong feels hard at times. Especially as I get older, the world in many ways seems more complex. In my late 20s, I was living with a roommate, and he came home. He owed me some money. He came home and he told me this great story. He said, I was at work, I had just walked out, I saw a guy getting into a cab, and as he got into the cab, I saw him drop something, and he took off in the cab, and I walked over, and it was 3 $100 bills. And I know that I owe you more, but I want you to have this to pay the debt. And I was really conflicted. I said to him, you should have reported this or tried to get a hold of the person. This is not your money. He said, oh, if they're going to drop $300 and not even notice it, then they clearly have a lot of money. Sometimes we all want to be Robin Hood, right? I really didn't know what to do. I tried to encourage him to find some way. I eventually said, I'd rather let the debt stand. If you're going to keep that money, you can use it how you want to, but you should pay me back in some other way. I don't want that money. But I debated, I have to admit, because in some senses that person had driven off, and my roommate didn't know that person, didn't know how to get a hold of them, contact them. What would you do necessarily? And he did owe me money that he then was offering to pay back. It was harder to tell what was right and what was wrong in that moment. And you would think that it'd be harder to tell with 7 cents, right? Because it's a much smaller sum of money. It is just not always clear what's right and what's wrong. And I know that there are some that want to believe that there is always a right and always a wrong. And I think a lot of the time there is, but the older I get, the more I realize how often it seems to get awfully muddy. And so, as Christians, we have to be the kind of people who are attuned to the sense of what is good and to really try to know it. This week, we watched Spider-Man: No Way Home, and one of the things that Spider-Man has after he's bitten by a radioactive spider is that he has what they call his spidey senses. He can tell things are coming at him in ways that a human just can't. And I found myself thinking about developing our spidey senses of good. One of the wonderful things about Peter Parker, who is Spider-Man, is that he has such a sense of what is good. In this latest movie, he's challenged to choose the better good. There are two goods in front of him, and he has to decide, do you go with the one good or the good that's gooder, for lack of a better term? I know that's not English. And he faces a really hard choice, and I think that we do as well, right? It's often clear if there's a right and a wrong. It's often harder when there's a right and a wrong. And he faces one of those situations. But he does choose to do the greater good because Peter Parker has this innate sense of good. It's interesting to watch him go through this decision process, though, because honestly, the movie starts with him in a very self-interested position. He wants to change the past, if possible. And so he goes to a wizard. Stick with me, it's superhero movies. He goes to a wizard and asks if there's a spell to change the past. And indeed there is. He's acting in a self-interested way in this moment because he's trying to solve a problem for he and his friends. But in the attempt to try to fix it, he creates a bigger problem. And that's a whole other sermon that I probably could have preached. But after that problem is created, he then has two ways that he can solve it. One that is good and the other that is going to accomplish even more good. And he chooses the harder way with the potential that it will do more good. And yet it will be more difficult to accomplish. He could just do the easy good thing and solve his problem, but he chooses to do the good that he can see needs to be done, which is the healing of some people that are broken. And of course, this is the hardest part for us. We can be attuned to what is good, and yet sometimes we can see that the good that we're trying to do is not guaranteed. We may try to help someone by giving them some money on a corner, but we may wonder if that actually is going to accomplish the good that we intend it to. And yet we are still called to be people who pursue good. And again, this is why Spider-Man is such a great movie to talk about today, because it's a wonderful example of this. Because one of the best parts about Spider-Man is that no matter what, he pursues the good. And this is a fascinating thing about Spider-Man, but that often he leaves behind him, in his undying desire to pursue good, he leaves a wake of destruction and chaos. You will hear him swinging through the streets, knocking things over, breaking things, and he's such a sweet kid that he's always like, sorry! But he is just creating havoc. But he's doing it because he's chasing after a bad guy or he wants to save somebody. It is always because of good. And look, I'm not encouraging you to do good by creating chaos in the world, but I do think that Spider-Man's single-mindedness to doing what is good is something that we, as followers of Jesus Christ, should all be striving for. And guess what? James thinks so too. We heard this passage that Joy read today, and James says a really hard phrase. He says, if you see good that needs to be done and you don't do it, that's sin. And that's a tough one to swallow, because we do a lot of good, but we also ignore a lot of chances to do good. I want you to be more like Spider-Man. And I can almost hear people saying right now, well, we're not superheroes. We've not been bit by radioactive spiders. At least not most of us. But here's the thing, you are superheroes. I've seen the kinds of good that you do in the world. We regularly collect almost 50 and sometimes over 50 pints of blood at our blood donations. And the people that come to that, many of them are church people. They're also community people. But those are people that are superheroes who are saving people's lives. We regularly give gifts from a fund in our church to people who are struggling to make it by paying the bills. And I know that at times people have taken money out of their own pockets here at the church to help people in need. There are people watching out for others in our community. I just was asked this week if there was a way to help someone who, has started going to another church because they're not able to get a ride to church here. And could we find a way to get them here? The answer is absolutely. I wasn't aware of that. But this person saw the good and they wanted to try to find a solution. You are superheroes. This is just a few small examples that I thought of as I wrote this sermon, but I know that there are many more. You are superheroes. And I know that you still doubt it, and that's why for one last time I'm going to say that Spider-Man is a great movie to preach on and a great character to preach on because of this reason. He is also just your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. That's what he always says. It's this sort of humble approach to being a superhero. He is not, for instance, Superman, who is an alien from another planet, right? This is just a kid from the local neighborhood. He's not Batman, who is not a superhero in the sense of having powers of any sort, but he has a ton of money. And that's not Peter Parker either. Peter Parker doesn't have a lot of money. He's just a normal kid. Good. We're glad to have you here. And what's interesting is that Peter Parker and Spider-Man have changed over time as well. Originally, some of the series of movies had the gifts that Peter was given by the bite from the spider be more extravagant. He had more superpowers. In the more recent version of Spider-Man, he's more dependent on a suit that he wears that is technology. And so it's interesting because he's been made even more humble in some senses, more human for sure. And I think that actually makes Peter Parker one of the most superheroes that there is because he is so human. And guess what? People know this too. I have a friend who has a 4-year-old niece, and she was telling me that her 4-year-old niece got to meet Spider-Man at the local library. And her 4-year-old niece has seen Spider-Man in other places and has always insisted that that's not Spider-Man. When she saw him in a parade, that was not Spider-Man. But for some reason, when she met him at the local library, she said, that's the real Spider-Man. And when they asked her why, she said, because that's the kind of thing that Spider-Man does. Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man isn't all puffed up about his superhero status. He shows up where he needs to, and sometimes that's signing autographs for little kids at a public library. And regardless, he is committed to doing the good that needs to be done in the world. And we need to be the same way. We need to see good and to do it. And so first, in order to be like Spider-Man, I think you need to decide that you want to do the good. Peter Parker has decided that that's what he's going to do. And in this particular movie, he faces a decision where he could, again, take the easier way out and solve his problem, which is good, but it would not do the greatest good. And he decides to instead do the greatest good. And once you've decided to do the good, then you need to do it. You have to commit to doing it. But here's what else we can learn from Spider-Man in this movie. He doesn't do it alone. He teams up with others to accomplish the greater good. And we are the same way. I think we often think of ourselves as lone rangers of goodness out there, but we don't have to be. We are part of a community of superheroes. We might call ourselves the Avengers or something. And then James gives us one other point that I think Spider-Man would agree with 100%. He says, don't boast about it. Just get down to the business of doing good. And this is interesting because in the beginning of this most recent movie, the issue that I mentioned before that Peter is challenged with trying to solve is that his identity has been exposed. Suddenly everyone knows that Spider-Man is Peter Parker and Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And he has to decide if this spell that this wizard cast, the result is that everyone will forget who he is. He can change the past, which is that he can have the issue of being revealed taken care of, but the sacrifice will be that everyone will forget him, including his family and his friends. And Peter ultimately makes that hard decision to be forgotten because he is such a humble person who understands that you don't want to boast about the good that you do. He is so single-minded about doing good that he would rather be completely forgotten by the people who know him and love him so that he can continue doing good than to be stopped from doing good because people know who he is and they're constantly hounding him. And I think James would say, that is it right there. That is the way to live as a follower of Jesus. So, my fellow superheroes, let's get out there and we'll keep doing what we've been doing. We're going to tune those spidey senses. Those Jesus senses. And we're going to look for the good. And we're going to always do it, never missing a chance to do good. Because that is who we are, created to be. Amen.